All right, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating singular historical inflection point, the May 2026 state visit by U.S. President Donald Trump to Beijing. Now, you have to remember, this wasn't just your standard diplomatic photo op. This was actually the first state visit by an American president to China in almost 9 years. We're talking about a high-stakes, deeply transactional meeting with one massive goal: transitioning the world's two largest economies from a period of unconstrained rivalry into this new era of managed strategic competition. So, as an objective third party, our goal today is to cut right through the political noise. We're going to look strictly at the data, the official readouts from both sides, and expert analyses to figure out what actually happened on the ground. Let's get into it. So here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the high stakes in tech context, then look at the corporate delegation, contrast the official trade narratives, navigate the red lines surrounding Taiwan, and finally wrap up with the Atlantic Council's verdict. Okay, Section 1, High Stakes and High Tech. Let's look at the global context of the 2026 summit. To really understand this summit, you have to understand the immense geopolitical pressure cooker it took place in. Let's look at the timeline. In October 2025, we had the Busan trade truce, which hit pause on a spiraling tariff war. Then, in January 2026, the U.S. kicks off its 250th anniversary celebrations, a moment the administration heavily utilized to project cultural confidence. But the massive shadow hanging over this entire summit, the ongoing 2026 Iran war. Foreign policy experts noted that this conflict severely disrupted global energy markets and actually forced the U.S. to divert critical military resources away from Japan and South Korea, redirecting them toward the Middle East. And analysts point out that this specific dynamic handed China some pretty unexpected diplomatic leverage right before the Beijing talks began. Which brings us to a foundational question, something I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we go through the evidence today. Did the 2026 summit actually resolve structural issues, or did it just install a temporary shock absorber? As the Council on Foreign Relations pointed out, the main goal here really seemed to be establishing guardrails, making sure that two nations didn't accidentally sleepwalk into a kinetic conflict, rather than actually solving their deep-rooted structural differences.
Moving on to Section 2, the business of diplomacy, corporate chess pieces.
Because, look, diplomacy today isn't just politicians in suits sitting in a room. It's heavily driven by the private sector. And the U.S. delegation to Beijing illustrates this perfectly. President Trump brought along a roster of roughly 30 top executives. We're talking agriculture, aviation, EVs, finance. You had Elon Musk from Tesla, Tim Cook from Apple, Larry Fink from BlackRock, and Kelly Ortberg from Boeing. But the absolute most fascinating detail here? NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang was a last-minute addition. He was literally scooped up in Alaska by Air Force One on its way over to China. I mean, that perfectly highlights how artificial intelligence and semiconductor access weren't just side topics. They were the central chess pieces of this entire negotiation. And speaking of chips, here's a prime example of the practical bottleneck in tech diplomacy. During the summit, the U.S. cleared the sale of highly advanced H200 chips to 10 Chinese firms. Now, on paper, that sounds like a massive breakthrough, right? But the devil is absolutely in the details. The deal structure requires the U.S. to take a 25% cut of the chip sale revenues. And because of American laws against direct export fees, these chips physically have to be routed through U.S. territory before they can even reach China. The end result? Despite all these cleared sales, not a single chip has actually shipped. China is understandably very reluctant to finalize purchases under these terms because they want to shield their local industry.
All right, Section 3, Trade. Spin versus substance. Let's contrast the official narratives.
So tech deals were complicated. What about traditional trade? Well, this is the core conflict we need to unpack. When the summit wrapped up, the narrative coming out of Washington sounded entirely different from the one coming out of Beijing. From Air Force One, President Trump announced what he called fantastic trade deals. He claimed China agreed to buy 200 Boeing aircraft with a potential for 750, along with billions in new soybean purchases and massive U.S. oil commitments. But flip over to the Chinese Foreign Ministry's readout. Spokesperson Guo Jiakun completely declined to publicly validate any of these specific multi-billion-dollar purchases. Instead, Beijing stuck to very broad, unspecific language, things like mutual benefit and win-win cooperation. Basically, there were zero receipts produced by Beijing to back up the specific deals Washington was claiming.
Now they did agree on something. Both sides agreed to establish a board of trade and a board of investment. But Yeah, as Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi noted, the working teams are still negotiating all the relevant details. Actual, concrete deliverables, incredibly scarce. In fact, one of the very few real announcements was China lifting an import ban on U.S. beef. But shortly after, Chinese customs authorities rapidly scaled that back. So, quite literally, observers were left asking, where's the beef?
Let's move to Section 4, Taiwan, Navigating Red Lines, the ultimate geopolitical flashpoint. If the trade discussions were all about spin versus substance, Taiwan was about navigating absolute, non-negotiable red lines. This issue remains the ultimate test of the U.S.-China diplomatic framework. In the very first bilateral meeting, President Xi Jinping issued an unusually blunt warning. Let me read you the quote directly from the readout. Taiwan independence and peace are as irreconcilable as fire and water. He made it crystal clear that mismanaging this issue would lead to clashes that could jeopardize the entire relationship. That is intense pressure right out of the gate. And the specific leverage point in this standoff? $14 billion. That is the exact value of a major U.S. arms package to Taiwan. It had already been approved by Congress, but it was delayed by the White House right before the summit. According to reports, Chinese leaders actively lobbied the administration to just cancel this package altogether. They were essentially hoping to use the promise of those trade deliverables we just talked about as a bargaining chip to weaken U.S. defense support for the island. So, the big question, did the U.S. yield? Well, according to the official statements on record, no. When a reporter asked about Taiwan on the flight home, President Trump said, on Taiwan, he feels very strongly. I made no commitment either way. So, impartially looking at the outcome here, while the arms package did remain delayed at the time of the summit, the administration did not formally fold to Chinese pressure to alter the long-standing One China policy. In fact, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio reiterated soon after that U.S. policy remained entirely unchanged.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the Atlantic Council verdict. Let's look at a think tank evaluation.
How do we objectively make sense of a summit where the trade deals are unconfirmed, the chips aren't shipping, and major security issues are basically at a standoff? Well, let's look at the assessment from the Atlantic Council. Melanie Hart, the senior director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, published a phenomenal analysis literally titled, Where's the Beef? Her core argument? She suggests that projecting an extreme eagerness for deals and then unilaterally announcing unconfirmed agreements actually allowed Chinese officials to play hardball. Basically, by signaling that Washington really wanted these symbolic wins, the U.S. inadvertently gave Beijing the leverage to hold back on making any actual structural concessions. But to be fair, the Atlantic Council's overall verdict is nuanced. They point out that while the U.S. underperformed on trade, the administration actually successfully sidestepped Xi's biggest trap on Taiwan, right? They refused to trade security commitments for economic favors. However, their overarching conclusion is pretty stark. A one-on-one, strongman approach to negotiation failed to produce any structural economic changes. Ultimately, the summit exposed the profound limits of using isolated bilateral strategies when you're dealing with a true peer competitor.
So what's the path forward? The think tank's recommendation is very clear. America's real leverage doesn't come from isolated one-on-one meetings. It comes from its network of allies. They recommend fast-tracking the U.S. Trade Representative's plurilateral critical minerals agreement with allied nations, basically creating an allies-only supply chain club. The strategy here is to establish a truly united economic front before President Xi makes his scheduled reciprocal visit to the U.S. in the fall of 2026.
And that brings us to the core strategic dilemma of the entire 2026 summit. It's a question I want to leave you to ponder. We've seen the spin today, we've looked at the actual substance, and we've explored the hard limits of a purely bilateral negotiation. So, in a world that is increasingly defined by transactional diplomacy, can the U.S. successfully manage China without the full weight of its allies behind it? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those tough questions, and as always, keep looking at the data.